Hi, Robert. Great to have you on again. How have you been? And congratulations on your book.
Great to be back. Thank you. Been great.
The book's been fantastic. I've read it. I recommend all of our listeners to give it a read. War About Rules. Would you say it's a bit, from reading it, it seems like a bit of a continuation from your previous book, going into a bit more detail. When you started writing the previous book, Stealth War, did you have a second book in mind when you were writing it?
No, not really. I think this, somebody recommended that maybe this would be an interesting route to pursue, and asked the publisher if they were interested, and of course they were. So that's how it came about. I do think that as opposed to Stealth War, this is far more in the Chinese Communist Party's own words. So I think it does lend a level of credibility to Stealth War, in that Stealth War was completely in my own words, and in this I'm trying to really just show the genius, really, and the visionary writing of two like myself, Air Force officers, but in the Chinese Communist Party's People's Liberation Army.
I'm guessing you're mentioning about the unrestricted warfare, which is really well documented in your book about what they sort of plan to do, and it can be quite, in some ways, hard to read at times. I think you've done really well in translating that. When did you first become aware of unrestricted warfare? And maybe you could explain it to some of our listeners, what exactly it is.
Well, it was written by two PLA Air Force colonels in 1997 and debuted in English in 1999. It was translated by our intelligence community's open source guys who basically get documents that are available in other languages in open source and do translations. In this case, I read it in 1999 when it came out, and I think a lot of people in the military did. It was it seemed to be interesting, but it was also a little bit kind of weird, maybe over the top, crazy. Talks about using tsunamis and earthquakes as weapons, and so when you kind of have the genius of the document, right next to something that's very hyperbolic, like using tsunamis for weapons, you tend to discount the whole thing. And given the fact it's also very difficult to read, it's not what you would consider a standard doctrine document. It is a doctrine document, and this is something that the military has, in terms of doctrine. Doctrine are lessons learned from prior wars that you use to create principles that then are used to plan future wars. And this is clearly what they were doing, but they also mixed it with philosophy and economics, and these are not typically things that you see in a military book. So when I read it the first time, I kind of discounted it, and I think most people did. There was a few that really thought this was something interesting, and I remember hearing from them, but those numbers were few and far between. Now, when I came back and reread it in 2014, with now the 15 years of hindsight of how the world had changed, and how the internet had grown, particularly the mobile internet, the introduction of the iPhone, how the world had really gone from one of industrial companies like General Electric leading the S&P 500 to tech companies like Facebook leading the S&P 500, and all that had to do with data. All of those things, I think, the hindsight of Russia moving into Crimea, the hindsight of the illegal islands in the South China Sea, all the things that you can see, like Hong Kong, all of that stuff, with the kind of the benefit of the past, in looking in rear view, rather than trying, like the colonels, to predict into the future. It's very clear to see, what they were saying. At the time, though, you have to remember the internet, the .com bubble was just happening. The internet was a new thing. There was no iPhone. We still had flip phones at the time. I used a dial-up modem to get on the internet. Google was brand new. So when you think of all of these things, just kind of the way that they saw the world going, or the opportunities that afforded, I think, is really what is so cool about the document. And so for me, that time, that first introduction, 1999, and then, rereading it in 2014, really, gave me the opportunity to understand how important it was.
With unrestricted warfare, you also related to quite a bit of The Art of War by Sun Tzu, which is another fantastic military book that I've read. What sort of comparisons can you see between two? I find it very striking, one of the sections, which was almost about how going into war, but without actually using any physical violence. I found that passage very, very interesting and striking. What other similarities do you see between those two, that book and the Unrestricted Warfare?
Well, I think Sun Tzu, who may or may not actually have been a person or a group of people in ancient China, talks about, the acme of a general is to win a war without fighting. And a lot of the discussion was around deception and how you play enemies off each other using guile. This is the way that Sun Tzu, and you go to battle only when you are sure that you can win, and you certainly don't go to battle when the stakes are high and you don't know or can't predict the outcome, because it can lead to disaster. And so, I think in a kind of as an overarching theme, the art of war has a lot to contribute to understanding unrestricted warfare. But if I was going to say what book most clearly kind of represents what they were trying to say, it's The Prince by Machiavelli.
Right.
And that's because The Prince, was not talking about warfare, but he was talking about, he did talk about warfare, but he was talking more about politics and how to gain political advantage. And if you understand the Chinese Communist Party and you understand Mao's, concept of People's War, the way that the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army think, People's Liberation Army is the armed component of the Chinese Communist Party. It's entirely about political struggle, and it's about, the political struggle against, those that have a different social, political, and economic ideology. Xi Jinping is first and foremost a Marxist, and he believes fundamentally in that, Marxist Leninist concepts. And he believes that the reason China today is ascendant is because it stayed true to those, original roots. And, the Chinese Communist Party's, these two PLA colonels are really laying out a path for creating global political struggle using the tools of the West. And I think that's the thing that's so amazing, in that before Facebook or Twitter was ever a thing, they recognized the tools of the internet and globalization that would propel Facebook and Twitter to great wealth would be an enormous boon to the Chinese Communist Party in terms of waging global political warfare. I mean, if you think about these two PLA colonels in the context of, the rise of Silicon Valley, they could have probably been the most wealthy venture capitalists in the world, because they predicted what Silicon Valley would become before Silicon Valley really, became that. And what I'm talking about is, again, this, where Facebook and Amazon and Apple and Netflix and Google became 25% of the S&P 500. Before that, there's probably some people that would have predicted that, but here's two military officers predicting, what was to come with the, the rise of globalization and the internet. And it was in its very early stages.
It is amazing when you think about the predictions from those two, and that sort of transition from the importance of the internet globalization as opposed to physical kind of warfare. And you allude to it in the second chapter, where you mention about how there was almost a new Cold War that was starting in 1989. That was a significant period where we starting to see the shift with China and the States in particular. Again, for our listeners who haven't read the book or don't quite understand that reference, how do you see China and the US becoming this sort of new, if you like, soft Cold War? How do you see it? How do you see it happened, and how do you see it going forward?
Well, I mean, one of the things that you have to recognize is that China works really, really hard to convince America that it's not in a new Cold War. And it does so because, in particular, in the Tiananmen papers, they talk about this need to continue to get technology and talent and capital from the West without allowing ideology to seep in. And so, what happened during the first Cold War is there was no global connective tissue. There was no global internet. There was no globalization. We strictly restricted trade with the Soviet Union for exactly the reason that China saw the opportunity. And so when you think about Khrushchev beating his shoe on the podium at the UN and saying, hey, we will bury you, and you contrast that with Deng Xiaoping's tour to the United States, where he met not only with the president, but with the leaders of Ford and Boeing and Intel, right? That's who he was, and requested their help in building the country and promised to give them access to 1.4 billion consumers. When you look at China's approach to how you compete with the West, it differed fundamentally from the Soviet Union. And it did so in a way that preyed on the weaknesses of our system, which is the tendency for openness and the tendency for cooperation, at least in a business sense. Now, when you think about that in terms of, the implications for our society, they're grave. But I think overall, they studied very clearly how the first Cold War went, and the conclusion they came to is that if you were going to win a Cold War with the West, then it had to be fundamentally different than the first Cold War. And the way it had to be different is that you had to convince the West that you were actually on their side, that you saw things the way that they did, and that you would play by their rules. And so, this doctrine that the two PLA colonels developed, it wasn't, they didn't make it up out of whole cloth. They had the 10 years after Tiananmen, where in the Tiananmen papers, they clearly say, look, we need this connection. We need the West to give us the things that we can grow to be powerful in order to defeat them. And the only way we can do that is to convince them that we're on their side. But we have to make sure that their ideology doesn't creep into our civilization. So we're going to have to harness these tools in ways that allow us to control the narrative, both in China and outside of China. And so that became their method of going in and influencing corporate sector, financial institutions, international institutions like the UN, the World Bank, and the World Health Organization. And how do you slowly begin to influence that in ways that are good for your interests, and don't raise the suspicion that you're actually seeking to change the terms of the international order. And so I think in terms of the second Cold War, it started the minute the first Cold War ended, except we were completely oblivious. And in some cases, I would say that we were complicit in our own demise because we felt that, we understood, China. And I don't think that we've had very many people, quite frankly, in the West who've ever understand understood China or the Chinese Communist Party. And that's been part of our big problem. Kissinger, who is supposed to be, the premier guy on China, is primarily a European historian, right? He's steeped in Westphalian politics, and yet he's the guy that we chose to send to China to really understand them, and then became the voice of a whole host of China experts that tried to put China in a box that resembled what they understood from European politics. And you can't. It's fundamentally different. And so when you think of, okay, first Cold War, it went a certain way. Second Cold War, and we can't say soft or hard Cold War. The reason you have the term cold means that you're not actually fighting with weapons. If you've seen the Chinese fighter recently pulled in front of a Australian P8 and released chaff so that was ingested to the engines, possibly causing damage to the engines, but not really shooting anything. This is exactly the way the first Cold War played out from a military perspective. There was a lot of these kind of engagements in the air and at sea that never led to war because of the danger of nuclear weapons. So you have to understand the second Cold War in many ways is like the first, but in many ways the shoe's on the other foot. In other words, we were the dominant economic power during the first Cold War. China has become the dominant economic power, especially from a productive capacity. And that's what we used to rebuild Western Europe and really enable us to win the first Cold War. So China basically studied all of the things that we did during the first Cold War, took those those lessons that applied, and now have since, at least Tiananmen, if not before, been implementing them in getting more successful at doing so as they've gained in economic power, in political power, and certainly in the international institutions that they participate in. And I think today it's overwhelmingly easy to see that they have a firm grasp on where the international order is going, and more importantly, they're leading it in the direction that they want it. And here, the United States is still kind of from a military perspective or a Cold War perspective, still stuck in the past. We're stuck in this kind of military, style strategy or framework from which to view the second Cold War, and it really does us enormous harm. And that's why this book is so important. It really lays out how we should think about national security and foreign policy differently in a globalized, internet-connected world.
One of the key things that you mentioned it there was about the rise of China and the use of a deception. Do you think a massive part of the deception was in the early stages, in the 80s and 90s, China almost falsely showing the West that they're almost a perception of weakness from China in terms of they're not as big as they actually are? And how did we in the West miss it? So how has it taken us, if you like, so long for us to now sort of recognize the superpower that is China? How did we miss this revolution that's happened in China?
Well, it's funny because when we consult China experts in the West, these China experts travel to China. That's why they're China experts. And then when they come back from China, the things that they say, eerily mimic what the Chinese themselves are saying. And so I think what they've been able to do is co-opt the people that we would listen to, like as, hey, these are the unbiased academic experts that can tell us what China is really like, when in reality, they've been essentially co-opted by the Chinese Communist Party as messengers. I mean, the Chinese are fabulous for doing stuff like this. They engage, for instance, they have these engagements with retired 4-star generals where they have them come over, they meet with, senior leaders, maybe even Xi Jinping, And then they come back to the US and they say, well, this is what China wants, and these are what the Chinese think. Well, that becomes a very powerful message for our own, national security policy and foreign policy. And it doesn't hurt that these, retired four stars are often sponsored by billionaires here in the West who have a financial interest to ensure that relations between the US and China go smoothly, because their investments are tied into this relationship between the US and China. So globalization, the internet, how we do business, the use of retired officials, whether they be four-star generals or congressmen or senators, or for instance, another good example is Ambassador Baucus, who was the US ambassador to China, is a very good advocate on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party in the United States. And in their minds, they are doing a service to America by keeping friction between the US and China at a low level, ensuring business, ensuring cooperation, ensuring partnership. But in essence, they're ensuring this kind of this desensitization of the slow draining of our productive capacity, our intellectual capital, our financial capital, as it gets pulled into China. So it's a very effective way of disarming us, because we generally rely on these experts in the military, former government, business, and academic. And China has relationships with, when I say China, the Chinese Communist Party has relationships with all of them. It's very effective. It's a very effective method.
One of the intros in the book you mentioned, I think that we actually discussed on it previously, is it's COVID-19, how it started and how it what was the sort of question of, was it made in a lab? Did China deliberately create this virus? And in the book, you make some really interesting points. Some that's well documented, actually, even here in the UK, that we've been discussing quite a bit, is how in 2020 there was a stage where you couldn't travel around China, but you could travel from Wuhan to, let's say, London or Florence or wherever. It's hard to really give a definitive answer whether it was man-made or what had happened, but it's clear to see how much they've almost benefited from COVID-19, and see that the response and how their economy has grown. Could that well be part of their strategy, part of their plan? I'm not necessarily that they've created the virus, but just generally the implications of what's happened since. Could that have been part of, if you like, a side of them taking a leaf out the unrestricted warfare?
Well, I mean, one of the things that certainly helped them was the fact that they had infiltrated, agencies like the World Health Organizations, academic institutions like the UK, the University in London. I can't remember the name of it. Where oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank now. Imperial College of London. That's it. Okay. The Imperial College of London, where Xi Jinping visited in 2015, and where Neil Ferguson, the epidemiologist, released the early epidemiology model, massively biased towards more deaths than we actually had. I mean, so that's clear. But I think what people don't understand, and what I think this book helps them start to frame the thinking of the Chinese Communist Party, is that an epidemic is both a challenge for China in terms of its population, but it also sees in every challenge an opportunity. And so where, the West or a Western country might consider a pandemic or epidemic to be, something that, hey, we need to protect our population. Not only do we need to protect our population, we need to be good stewards of this world we live in and protect, others around us. We need to act in concert with others to protect. That's one way to look at a pandemic. Another way to look at a pandemic is, how do I take advantage of the situation so that I gain while others lose? And that is the key. And so when you have that, in mind, and you start to say, well, how do I create these things, these policies, and these interactions that benefit us? One of them is, hey, if I create massive fear, and then I recommend policies that are believed to have worked, then they'll be adopted. And this really was, one of the big ways they took advantage of it is, they had the lockdown in Wuhan in January 23rd, 2020, and the CDC and the World Health Organization said this is not a pandemic response. This is nowhere in our playbook, and yet within weeks, so WHO was saying, hey, China's use of lockdown in Wuhan is effective, and we need to adopt that. And now you see it being spoken of at the World Health Organization as the way we should do things for every pandemic in the future. Now, if you look at the numbers and the data, it's not supported that lockdowns work. In fact, they're actually damaging to societies. And more importantly, they come from a totalitarian society where the people have no rights and the government can do whatever they want with them. And yet this is being, established globally for democracies, through the World Health Organization, which is an international institution, formed after the United States and Europe, won the Cold War, and were pushing, kind of the principles of democracy widely throughout these institutions. So basically, completely flipped the model, so that we've forgotten the Nuremberg trials, we've forgotten the requirements of these principles of liberty that are established in these international institutions. And now we're adopting kind of the proposals of the Chinese Communist Party, a totalitarian regime, as the way that we should organize in the future. And I think so. This is how they use the coronavirus. It's not. I don't make any claims about knowing their origin. What I tell you is the way they look at the world, and then how they use what they have learned, and particularly how they have essentially influenced the international order to include the corporate sector and the financial sector, so that they can turn a tragedy like the pandemic into a benefit for the Chinese Communist Party, which is essentially what they did.
Well, I think that's probably a good note to end it on. Thank you for your time, Robert. And to all our listeners, definitely do go out there and get the new book, War Without Rules. It's a fantastic book. Thoroughly recommend it. I've learned a lot from it. It's great to get the translations in Unrestricted Warfare. I've Googled it in the past before, but it's so difficult to really understand. So it was good to get a deeper understanding on that. So I do thoroughly recommend it to our listeners and everyone else. And yeah, thank you for your time, Robert. And I'm sure we'll have you on again soon.
Thank you.